Hello everybody and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. This time we'll talk about why we actually need to use DTOs in our APIs. And this is one of the questions that I have received a lot of times as comments in the different videos, especially in those where I was talking about APIs in ASP.NET Core. And I think it's time to demystify a little bit this concept of using DTOs and understand why we actually really need them and why they are useful. Now in this video we won't use AutoMapper to handle mapping from domain models to DTOs. For this purpose, we will have a totally separate video that you might find in the description of this one. So we will concentrate only about this main concept of what actually a DTO is and why we need it. So let's get started from the beginning. And of course, we need some context in order to better understand why we actually need those DTOs. So I have set up here a very basic project with a very basic domain model and an API endpoint for that. Let's take a look first at what we have in the domain model, because this is a very important part of why we actually might need to use DTOs. So let's go here. We have here a book class that has an ID, a title, and of course it has an I collection of authors, because a book can have several authors. So it's not necessarily that a book is written only by author. It could be that it's written by 2 or 3 or even more authors. And on the other hand, we have this class author, which consists of a first name, last name, bio. And of course, one author could write different books. And therefore we have here an I collection of books. We also use Entity Framework Core, but we use the in-memory provider right now. But I really don't want to focus on that. The only thing that is maybe here important to note is that we have here a many-to-many relationship, because we have here an I collection of books. So this points toward the book class. And in the book class, we have an I collection that points actually back to the authors class. And this is a very, I would say, specific or clear many-to-many scenario. So this is what we have in our domain model right now. Now, in our controller, for instance, right now, what we do is we just use the DB context, and here in this case, we return a list of books. Here we want to get a book by ID, so we return the book by ID. And here we have this create book action where we can actually pass in as a body when we make the API call a book object. So it would mean that we would have to pass here all this entire object when we actually do that. So this is the very basic setup where I don't use any DTOs. Now, what I want to do to better understand why we actually need them, I would just like to run this application, and let's take a look at the Swagger documentation of that. So it opened on a different window. I will bring it here on this one. So let's take a look, for instance, at this API get books. So this would get all the books. Of course, this is a GET request, but what we have here is actually the response type. Now, when we look here at this response type, this should contain a list of books. Of course, right now we have or we will have for now in our database or in our in-memory database only one book. But the idea is that it contains the ID of the book. In this case, this is okay, because consumers of your API might need to know which ID belongs to which book if they want to query, for instance, for one single book, or if they want to perform a certain action. So returning the ID in this case is maybe not wrong. But then we have the title that we return, which is also okay. But then what we have here, remember our domain model, we have actually an I collection of author. And this means that we return here actually the entire author with the ID, the first name, last name, bio, and the I collection of books. And this is where the tricky part comes in, because when we get a book, now we have to actually understand logically what our API contract is and what it should return. Now, when I get a book, for instance, the idea is that, okay, I want to see which are the authors of that book. So having the authors here is okay as a property, but when I want to check the authors here, I actually don't need the ID of the author. I just want to have a first name, a last name, and a bio. And that's all that I want for an author to show when we retrieve a single book. Because if we want to get the full information about the author, then we would have an author controller that would expose all the information. So this is one scenario where we would have to actually transition or change this to not return the entire author here, but just return a portion of it that is actually needed for this specific action. Because all the other information in this context is really not relevant at all. The only relevant thing here is to have a first name, a last name, and maybe a bio of the author of the book, and that's it. We don't need to show anything else here. Now let's go over to another endpoint, and this is the endpoint where we actually create a book. Now, of course, as we saw that we need in the body as a JSON an entire book object, because this is what we put right there, our book model. Now here, the first thing is the ID. The problem is when you are posting objects and when you're using most of ORMs and of course Entity Framework Core with SQL Server, then the problem is that we don't need to specify the ID when we post the object. The ID is generated by the database or by EF Core itself, depending on what data type you actually choose for the ID. So exposing this property as a JSON field is not okay, because consumers should never provide an ID when they want to create a book. This is something that will be generated by the database. Then of course we have the title of the book, which is okay. But then we have this list of authors. And when I create a book, I really don't want to do that. So maybe when I create a book, I just want to add the ID and the title, and I would have a separate endpoint for adding an author. Or if I still want to add the authors here from this book, I wouldn't need to have all the authors' details. What I would need here is only the IDs of the authors that have written this book. So instead of having here authors as an array of an entire object of author, it would be sufficient to have an array that contains only IDs of the authors that should belong to that book, and that's it. So this is why just using our domain model is actually not a very good idea, because we expose a lot of information, especially for post requests, that consumers actually don't need to provide at all. All this information here, for instance, in this post is actually information that is not needed at all. And we still transmit it via HTTP. So that's actually that our requests will get bigger and processing will take longer and similar things like that. And this is, of course, not a very good reason to handle that. So in this case, we would just need a DTO for posting that would contain here only an array of integers that would represent the IDs of the authors that need to be added to this specific book object. So these are already, we have seen two reasons why we actually need DTOs, because the data that we have in our domain model is not always the data that we actually need or should expose in our API contracts. But then I would also like to show you a way more technical reason why we should use DTOs in our APIs. And for this one, I'll still stay here on Swagger, but let's try to execute this get books endpoint. So let's click on try it out and let's click on execute. And we see that we have an error. So we have received an exception back. This exception reads a possible object cycle was detected. This can either be due to the cycle or if the object depth is longer than the maximum allowed depth of 32. Now, this is an error that, or an exception that comes from system.txt, and then of course JSON exceptions. And of course, it's a little bit cryptic, and probably it's very hard to understand what exactly this problem is all about. But let's close this right now and try to understand what actually happened in the background. And for this, I want us to take a look once again at our data model. Now, the idea is that our book contains a list of author, and each author contains a list of books. Now, the problem is that when we return this list here, and when we try, or when ASP.NetCore tries to serialize it to a JSON object, at a certain point, actually, it arrives here with the serialization and starts to serialize this and looks for the authors. So for all authors, it will actually use the first name, last name, and so on. But then the serializer will arrive at these books. And then what will try it to do? Of course, it will try to serialize the books that belongs to the author. So it goes back here and starts from scratch. Then it creates an ID and title, and it arrives once again here at the collection when everything actually goes back to the author and it starts from scratch. So basically we have here an infinite loop of trying to serialize different collections that actually reference each other, and basically it never exits this loop, and when it reaches a depth of 32, then we get this type of exception. So this is also an error that you might always get. I can assure you, you might always get this error if you are not using DTOs. Of course, you can maybe choose to exclude or not include when you are doing the query with entity framework to not include this collection, and then it would work. But in most cases, when you're doing a get, you want to show which are actually the authors of that book, because having an endpoint that returns you a book without the authors, well, that might not be very, very useful. So as you see, this is also a very, very technical reason why we actually use DTOs, because in these scenarios where we will have many-to-many relationships, and you'll have plenty of these scenarios when you're working on real projects, we will always get this type of exception if we don't actually use DTOs, because in the DTOs we can model exactly what we need to give back. And for instance, here from author, when I retrieve an author from a book object, I don't really care about what other books that author has written. For that, I will have a totally different endpoint. So I would exclude from my author DTO this property here, and then everything should work okay. Now, let's get over and try to solve this problem that we have right now by introducing this concept of DTOs, or data transfer objects. So to do that, let's add here a new folder, and let's call this DTOs. And here in this folder, let us add first a new class, and we'll call this book author DTO. Okay, I guess I want to rename it because I have an R at the end that doesn't belong there, and click yes. Okay, so what do I want actually to return back from an author that belongs to a book? So when we make a call to get all books. Now, I don't want the ID. This one is really not important in this case. If I want the IDs of the authors, I would use the authors endpoint. So let's have here a public string first name. What we would also need is a last name for this user, or for this author, sorry. And let's say that we also need the bio for this author. So let's do that. String and bio. And that's it. When I get a book or a list of books, all the information that I want to see about an author is actually only this: the first name, the last name, and the bio. I don't care what other books that author has written, because I am in a certain book object and I want to see the authors that have written that book. I really don't care what other books those authors might have written. So it's really not important. For that, we have a separate endpoint. So we have this book author DTO. And now let's also create a book DTO, add a new class, and let's call it book DTO. And in this case, for the book, I said I want the ID because we retrieve a list of books, and the consumers of the APIs would have to know the IDs of the books in order to retrieve them individually if needed, or perform actions on those books and things like that. So the ID is needed. So let's create an ID here. Then for the book, what I also have is the title. And then the only other thing that I need right now, of course, if you model a real book, you would have far more properties than this, but I would really like to concentrate on the concepts that we discuss right now and not on anything else. So the other thing that we need is this I collection. Now, let me go back here to this book DTO, and we'll have here a public it would be an I collection, but in this case, it would be the I collection of a book author DTO, not of author DTO, because author contains all the information that we actually don't care about when we retrieve a single book. So let's call this also authors get set, and that should be it actually for the DTOs. So you see that we have changed this a little. In the book is actually quite the same, only that it contains an I collection of book author DTO, not the book, not the author DTO. And the book author contains only the information that we need for this specific task. So when we retrieve a book or a list of books, we just want to see the first name, last name, and bio of the author. We don't really care here what other books that author might have written. So if we go back to our controller right now, we could then go here back in this method and try to rewrite things a little bit. And as said, I don't want to use AutoMapper right now. We will have a separate video on AutoMapper, and you will find it in the description of this video or on a card here somewhere on the screen. And it will follow very, very shortly after we publish this one. And in that case, actually, this is where we will start from when we'll talk about AutoMapper, because we'll see exactly here, okay, what is the problem that we have when we use DTOs, and then we'll see what problems actually AutoMapper help us to solve. So let's get started in here. We might need books that would contain, in this case, the context books to list. So exactly what we are returning right now. But then also for the book DTO, sorry for that, we need to initialize this list to an empty one. So let's create here the default constructor, and let's say authors equals new list. You could use any collection type here, because this is why you use this interface I collection, so that we are not restricted on what collection type we can initialize here. So that should work right now. Now, let's go back to our controller, and what we need here is, let's call this book DTOs. So this will be a collection that will contain all the books that we actually want to return to the caller, so, or to the client that actually made this request. And for now, we just initialize this to a new list of book DTO. Okay, let's add this one here. And of course, what we would need to do right now is kind of loop through all the books that we have here, and then map all the informations from our domain model to our DTO. So let's do it the following way. Book, sorry, this should be books here. We should pluralize this because it is a list. So books, and then we can use the for each method in link to perform some action. And for each book, we want to execute some code here. So for each book, the first thing that we want to do is actually create a new book DTO. Var book DTO equals new book DTO. And of course, we can also use here maybe an object initializer, because we already know what information we want to populate. We want the ID of the book, and it should be book.id, so the ID from the book model. Then we have the title, and that would be book.title, so the title from our domain models, or from what we retrieve from our database. And that's actually it. Right now, what we have to do is actually to iterate through all the authors from the book that we receive from the database and create an author DTO and add this to the book DTO author list. So that might sound a little bit complicated, but in this case, let's alternate the techniques a little bit, and we'll use a for each loop. And we see that for each author in book.authors, how is it called? It should be book. Why is this? So in book, sorry for all the typos here. Okay, let's see here. This book is of type book, and it has an I collection of author. Let me just see why is here a problem, because this book is a book, so everything should be okay. And let's see, the name book does not exist in the current yeah, of course, sorry, I totally missed that. Sorry for that, because of course the for each should be in the same lambda. Sorry for that. This is the problem, because we are still here while we iterate through this books collection, and while we are on a certain book, we want to actually do that. Yeah, sorry for this, I was not careful. Okay, now what we need to do here is create, of course, a new var author DTO equals new author DTO. And we can also use here this collection initializer, and all the information that we care about is first name. It would be equal to author.firstname, and we care about last name. That would be equal to author.lastname, and we also care about bio, which would be equal to author.bio. So once we have done this, what we could do is actually add this author DTO to the book DTO. So therefore, we can use book DTO.authors.add and the author DTO. And when we are ready with all the authors from a book, what we can do here is, well, we can simply use the book DTOs and add this current book DTOs that we have created, but we have to be inside the same lambda function here, of course. So what we'll do here is book DTOs.add, and we'll add the book DTO. Okay, and now instead of returning this list, we just return the book DTOs. Let's also change here the produces response type that we have here, this attribute for Swagger, and instead of book, we will have a book DTO instead. And then it will contain all that information. Good. So I guess that we would be good to run this application. So let's run this application again and see exactly if we solved our problem and if we can retrieve the books right now without getting an error, and of course also seeing only the information that we actually want to see for a book right now. So try it out, execute, and as you can see here right now we have an answer which is correct because we have here the book with the ID 1. As said, our database, our in-memory database contains only one book right now. It has a title, and then for the authors, for each author, we just see the first name, the last name, and the bio. This is everything that actually is of interest. When we look at an author, once again, in a book object, if we want to look at the author and in its, let's say, full properties, we would have a dedicated authors endpoint for that. But once again, these are a few reasons why we need DTOs. So the summary is, first of all, from a logical point perspective, is that our domain model contains a certain set of data, but when we actually create our API responses, most of the times there is not a one-to-one mapping of the data that we actually have in the model and what we need and should actually display or respond to our requester. And this is the first reason why we need a DTO. Then for post and updates, usually when you need to provide a JSON body when you make the call, you don't want to use the entire domain model for that once again, because usually you have in the domain model a lot of more data, but the data that a client should actually provide when it wants to create a new resource is limited probably to just a few fields. And then that body should contain only those fields, not the entire domain model. But then the third reason why we should use DTOs, and as we have seen, it's a pure technical one. When you have many-to-many relationships and you just want to use your domain model and return it to a get all or get by ID, then you would always have this type of error that we had from the JSON serializer, because you have two properties that infinitely point to one, point from one to the other. And that loops actually, or that loop of pointing from one to the other never stops actually. And this is why you get the error. So there is also a very, very technical reason why we need to use DTOs. So this being said, I hope that this video clarified this whole concept of DTOs and why we need to use them. As promised, very soon there will be a new video on using AutoMapper, and in that video we will look into exactly how we can make everything much easier than that. And instead of writing here a lot of lines of code, we will just have one where we can automatically actually map our domain model entities to our DTOs using AutoMapper. Once again, if you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please don't be shy. Hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button if you didn't do it already. And if you think you have colleagues, friends, peers that might also find this content useful, don't be shy and share it with them. Sharing is caring, as we say. And of course, if you have other questions or comments, or if you just want to add something, once again, don't be shy and use the comment section of this video. I am very, very happy to get the discussion going, and I'm waiting for your comments. Thank you once again very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very